Chapter 18. Mr. Bevan Makes a Suggestion. When one has been working hard with a single end in view, the arrival and departure of the supreme moment is apt to leave a feeling of emptiness, as if life had been drained of all its interest, and left nothing sufficiently exciting to make it worth doing. Horatius, as he followed his plough on a warm day over the cornland which his gratified country bestowed on him for his masterly handling of the traffic on the bridge, must sometimes have felt it was a little tame. The feeling is far more acute when one has been unexpectedly balked in one's desire for action. Sheen, for the first few days after he received Drummond's brief note, felt that it was useless for him to try to do anything. The fates were against him. In stories, as Mr. Anstey had pointed out, the hero is never long without his chance of retrieving his reputation. A mad bull comes into the school grounds, and he alone, the hero, not the bull, is calm. Or there is a fire, and whose is that pale and gesticulating form at the upper window? The bully's, of course. And who is that climbing nimbly up the Virginia creeper? Why, the hero! Who else? 3 hearty cheers for the plucky hero! But in real life opportunities of distinguishing oneself are less frequent. Sheen continued his visits to the Blue Boar, but more because he shrank from telling Joe Bevan that all his trouble had been for nothing, than because he had any definite object in view. It was bitter to listen to the eulogies of the pugilist, when all the while he knew that, as far as any immediate results were concerned, it did not really matter whether he boxed well or feebly. Some day, perhaps, as Mr. Bevan was fond of pointing out when he approached the subject of disadvantages of boxing, he might meet a hooligan when he was crossing a field with his sister. But he found that but small consolation. He was in the position of one who wants a small sum of ready money, and is told that, in a few years, he may come into a fortune. By the time he got a chance of proving himself a man with his hands, he would be an old Wrykinian. He was leaving at the end of the summer term. Jack Bruce was sympathetic, and talked more freely than was his wont. "I can't understand it," he said. "Drummond always seemed a good sort. I should have thought he would have sent you in for the house like a shot. Are you sure you put it plainly in your letter? What did you say?" Sheen repeated the main points of his letter. "Did you tell him who had been teaching you?" "No, I just said I'd been boxing lately." "Pity," said Jack Bruce. "If you'd mentioned that it was Joe who'd been training you, he would probably have been much more for it. You see, he couldn't know whether you were any good or not from your letter. But if you'd told him that Joe Bevan and Hunt both thought you were good, he'd have seen there was something in it." "It never occurred to me. Like a fool, I was counting on the thing so much that it didn't strike me there would be any real difficulty in getting him to see my point, especially when he got mumps and couldn't go in himself. Well, it can't be helped now." And the conversation turned to the prospects of Jack Bruce's father in the forthcoming election, the polling for which had just begun. "I'm busy now," said Bruce. "I'm not sure that I shall be able to do much sparring with you for a bit." "My dear chap, don't let me—" "Oh, it's all right, really. Taking you to the Blue Boar doesn't land me out of my way at all. Most of the work lies round in this direction. I call at cottages, and lug oldest inhabitants to the poll. It's rare sport." "Does your pater know?" "Oh, yes, he rots me about it like anything. But all the same, I believe he's really rather bucked because I've roped in quite a dozen voters who wouldn't have stirred a yard if I hadn't turned up. That's where we're scoring. Pedder hasn't got a car yet, and these old rotters round here aren't going to move out of their chairs to go for a ride in any ordinary cart, but they chuck away their crutches and hop into a motor like 1 o'clock. "It must be rather a rag," said Sheen. The car drew up at the door of the Blue Boar. Sheen got out and ran upstairs to the gymnasium. Joe Bevan was sparring around with Francis. He watched them while he changed, but without the enthusiasm of which he had been conscious on previous occasions. The solid cleverness of Joe Bevan, and the quickness and cunning of the bantamweight, were as much in evidence as before, but somehow the glamour and romance which had surrounded them were gone. He no longer watched eagerly to pick up the slightest hint from these experts. He felt no more interest than he would have felt in watching a game of lawn tennis. He had been keen. Since his disappointment with regard to the house boxing, he had become indifferent. Joe Bevan noticed this before he had been boxing with him a minute. "Hello, sir," he said. "What's this? Tired today? Not feeling well? You aren't boxing like yourself, not at all you aren't. There's no weight behind 'em. You're tapping. What's the matter with your feet, too? You aren't getting about as quickly as I should like to see. What have you been doing to yourself?" "Nothing that I know of," said Sheen. "I'm sorry I'm so rotten. Let's have another try." The second try proved as unsatisfactory as the first. He was listless, and his leads and counters lacked conviction. Joe Bevan, who identified himself with his pupils with that thoroughness which is the hallmark of the first-class boxing instructor, looked so pained at his sudden loss of form that Sheen could not resist the temptation to confide in him. After all, he must tell him some time. "The fact is," he said, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the river, waiting for Jack Bruce to return with his car, "I've had a bit of a sickener." "I thought you'd got sick of it," said Mr. Bevan. "Well, have a bit of a rest." "I don't mean that I'm tired of boxing," Sheen hastened to explain. "After all the trouble you've taken with me, it would be a bit thick if I chucked it just as I was beginning to get on. It isn't that. But you know how keen I was on boxing for the house?" Joe Bevan nodded. "Did you get beat?" "They wouldn't let me go in," said Sheen.
"But, bless me, you'd have made babies of them. What was the instructor doing? Couldn't he see that you were good?"
"I didn't get a chance of showing what I could do." He explained the difficulties of the situation. Mr. Bevan nodded his head thoughtfully. "So naturally," concluded Sheen, "the thing has put me out a bit. It's beastly having nothing to work for. I'm at a loose end. Up till now I've always had the thought of the house competition to keep me going, but now, well, you see how it is. It's like running to catch a train, and then finding suddenly that you've got plenty of time. There doesn't seem any point in going on running."
"Why not Aldershot, sir?" said Mr. Bevan.
"What?" cried Sheen. The absolute novelty of the idea, and the gorgeous possibilities of it, made him tingle from head to foot. Aldershot! Why hadn't he thought of it before? The house competition suddenly lost its importance in his eyes. It was a trivial affair, after all, compared with Aldershot, that Mecca of the public school boxer. Then the glow began to fade. Doubts crept in. He might have learned a good deal from Joe Bevan, but had he learned enough to be able to hold his own with the best boxers of all the public schools in the country? And if he had the skill to win, had he the heart? Joe Bevan had said that he would not disgrace himself again, and he felt that the chances were against his doing so, But there was the terrible possibility. He had stood up to Francis and the others, and he had taken their blows without flinching, but in these encounters there was always at the back of his mind the comforting feeling that there was a limit to the amount of punishment he would receive. If Francis happened to drive him into a corner where he could neither attack nor defend himself against attack, he did not use his advantage to the full. He indicated rather than used it. A couple of blows, and he moved out into the open again. But in the public schools competition at Aldershot there would be no quarter. There would be nothing but deadly earnest. If he allowed himself to be maneuvered into an awkward position, only his own skill or the call of time could extricate him from it. In a word, at the Blue Boar he sparred. At Aldershot he would have to fight. Was he capable of fighting? Then there was another difficulty. How was he to get himself appointed as the Wrykyn lightweight representative? Now that Drummond was unable to box, Stanning would go down as the winner of the school competition. These things were worked by an automatic process. Sheen felt that he could beat Stanning, but he had no means of publishing this fact to the school. He could not challenge him to a trial of skill. That sort of thing was not done. He explained this to Joe Bevan.
"Well, it's a pity," said Joe regretfully. "It's a pity."
At this moment Jack Bruce appeared.
"What's a pity, Joe?"
he asked. "Joe wants me to go to Aldershot as a lightweight," explained Sheen, "and I was just saying that I couldn't because of Stanning."
"What about Stanning?"
"He won the school competition, you see, so they're bound to send him down."
"Half a minute," said Jack Bruce. "I never thought of Aldershot for you before. It's a jolly good idea. I believe you'd have a chance. And it's all right about Stanning. He's not going down. Haven't you heard?"
"I don't hear anything. Why isn't he going down?"
"He's knocked up one of his wrists. So he says."
"How do you mean, so he says?" asked Sheen.
"I believe he funks it."
"Why? What makes you think that?"
"Oh, I don't know. It's only my opinion. Still, it's a little queer. Stanning says he crocked his left wrist in the final of the house competition."
"Well, what's wrong with that? Why shouldn't he have done so?" Sheen objected strongly to Stanning, but he had the elements of justice in him, and he was not going to condemn him on insufficient evidence, particularly of a crime of which he himself had been guilty.
"Of course he may have done," said Bruce, "but it's a bit fishy that he should have been playing fives all right 2 days running just after the competition."
"He might have crocked himself then."
"Then why didn't he say so?"
A question which Sheen found himself unable to answer.
"Then there's nothing to prevent you fighting, sir," said Joe Bevan, who had been listening attentively to the conversation.
"Do you really think I've got a chance?"
"I do, sir."
"Of course you have," said Jack Bruce. "You're quite as good as Drummond was last time I saw him box." "Then I'll have a shot at it," said Sheen.
"Good for you, sir!" cried Joe Bevan.
"Though it'll be a bit of a job getting leave," said Sheen. "How would you start about it, Bruce?"
"You'd better ask Spence. He's the man to go to."
"That's all right. I'm rather a pal of Spence's."
"Ask him tonight after prep," suggested Bruce. "And then you can come here regular," said Joe Bevan, "and we'll train you till you're that fit you could eat bricks, and you'll make babies of them up at Aldershot."
End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. Paving the Way. Bruce had been perfectly correct in his suspicions. Stanning's wrist was no more sprained than his ankle. The advisability of manufacturing an injury had come home to him very vividly on the Saturday morning following the Ripton match, when he had read the brief report of that painful episode in that week's number of the Field in the school library. In the list of the Ripton team appeared the name R. Petero. He had heard a great deal about the dusky Riptonian when Drummond had beaten him in the featherweights the year before. Drummond had returned from Aldershot on that occasion cheerful, but in an extremely battered condition. His appearance as he limped about the field on Sports Day had been heroic, and, in addition, a fine advertisement for the punishing powers of the Ripton champion. It is true that at least one of his injuries had been the work of a Pauline whom he had met in the opening bout, but the great majority were presents from Ripton, and Drummond had described the dusky one in no uncertain terms as a holy terror. These things had sunk into Stanning's mind. It had been generally understood at Wrykyn that Petero had left school at Christmas. When Stanning, through his study of the field, discovered that the redoubtable boxer had been one of the team against which he had played at Ripton, and realized that, owing to Drummond's illness, it would fall to him, if he won the house competition, to meet this man of wrath at Aldershot, he resolved on the instant that the most persuasive of wild horses should not draw him to that military centre on the day of the public schools competition. The difficulty was that he particularly wished to win the House Cup. Then it occurred to him that he could combine the two things, win the competition, and get injured while doing so. Accordingly, 2 days after the house boxing he was observed to issue from Appleby's with his left arm slung in a first 15 scarf. He was too astute to injure his right wrist. What happens to one's left wrist at school is one's own private business. When one injures one's right arm, and so incapacitates oneself for form work, the authorities begin to make awkward investigations. Mr. Spence, who looked after the school's efforts to win medals at Aldershot, was the most disappointed person in the place. He was an enthusiastic boxer. He had represented Cambridge in the middleweights in his day, and with no small trouble he had succeeded in making boxing a going concern at Wrykyn. Years of failure had ended, the Easter before, in a huge triumph, when O'Hara of Dexter's and Drummond had won silver medals, and Moriarty of Dexter's a bronze. If only somebody could win a medal this year, the tradition would be established and would not soon die out. Unfortunately, there was not a great deal of boxing talent in the school just now. The rule that the winner at his weight in the house competitions should represent the school at Aldershot only applied if the winner were fairly proficient. Mr. Spence exercised his discretion. It was no use sending down novices to be massacred. This year Drummond and Stanning were the only Wrykynians up to Aldershot form. Drummond would have been almost a certainty for a silver medal, and Stanning would probably have been a runner-up. And here they were, both injured. Wrykyn would not have a single representative at the Queen's Avenue Gymnasium. It would be a setback to the cult of boxing at the school. Mr. Spence was pondering over this unfortunate state of things when Sheen was shown in. "Can I speak to you for a minute, sir?" said Sheen. "Certainly, Sheen. Take one of those sit down. What is it?" Sheen had decided how to open the interview before knocking at the door. He came to the point at once. "Do you think I could go down to Aldershot, sir?" he asked. Mr. Spence looked surprised. "Go down? You mean—" "Do you want to watch the competition? Really, I don't know if the headmaster—" "I mean, can I box?" Mr. Spence's look of surprise became more marked.
"Box," he said. "But surely I didn't know you were a boxer, Sheen."
"I've only taken it up lately."
"But you didn't enter for the house competitions, did you? What weight are you?"
"Just under 10 stone."
"A light weight? Why, Linton boxed for your house in the light weight, surely?"
"Yes, sir. They wouldn't let me go in."
"You hurt yourself?"
"No, sir."
"Then why wouldn't they let you go in?"
"Drummond thought Linton was better. He didn't know I boxed."
"But this is very curious. I don't understand it at all. You see, if you were not up to house form, you would hardly— At Aldershot, you see, you would meet the best boxers of all the public schools."
"Yes, sir."
There was a pause.
"It was like this, sir," said Sheen nervously. "At the beginning of the term there was a bit of a row down in the town, and I got mixed up in it. And I was afraid to join in. I funked it." Mr. Spence nodded. He was deeply interested now. The office of confessor is always interesting.
"Go on, Sheen. What happened then?"
"I was cut by everybody. The fellows thought I had let the house down, and it got about, and the other houses scored off them, so I had rather a rotten time." Here it occurred to him that he was telling his story without that attention to polite phraseology which a master expects from a boy, so he amended the last sentence. "I didn't have a very pleasant time, sir," was his correction.
"Well?"
said Mr. Spence. "So I was a bit sick," continued Sheen, relapsing once more into the vernacular, "and I wanted to do something to put things right again, and anyhow, I took up boxing. I wanted to box for the house, if I was good enough. I practised every day, and stuck to it, and after a bit I did become pretty good."
"Well?"
"Then Drummond got mumps, and I wrote to him asking if I might represent the house instead of him, and I suppose he didn't believe I was any good. At any rate, he wouldn't let me go in. Then Joe, a man who knows something about boxing, suggested I should go down to Aldershot."
"Joe?"
said Mr. Spence inquiringly. Sheen had let the name slip out unintentionally, but it was too late now to recall it. "Joe Bevan, sir," he said. "He used to be champion of England, light weight."
"Joe Bevan!" cried Mr. Spence. "Really? Why, he trained me when I boxed for Cambridge. He's one of the best of fellows. I've never seen anyone who took such trouble with his man. I wish we could get him here. So it was Joe who suggested that you should go down to Aldershot? Well, he ought to know. Did he say you would have a good chance?" "Yes, sir." "My position is this, you see, Sheen. There is nothing I should like more than to see the school represented at Aldershot. But I cannot let any one go down, irrespective of his abilities. Aldershot is not child's play, and in the light weights you get the hardest fighting of all. It wouldn't do for me to let you go down if you are not up to the proper form. You would be half killed." "I should like to have a shot, sir," said Sheen. "Then this year, as you probably know, Ripton are sending down Petero for the light weights. He was the fellow whom Drummond only just beat last year, and you saw the state in which Drummond came back. If Drummond could hardly hold him, what would you do?" "I believe I could beat Drummond, sir," said Sheen. Mr. Spence's eyes opened wider. Here were brave words. This youth evidently meant business. The thing puzzled him. On the one hand, Sheen had been cut by his house for cowardice. On the other, Joe Bevan, who of all men was best able to judge,
had told him that he was good enough to box at Aldershot. "Let me think it over, Sheen," he said. "This is a matter which I cannot decide in a moment. I will tell you tomorrow what I think about it." "I hope you will let me go down, sir," said Sheen. "It's my one chance." "Yes, yes, I see that," said Mr. Spence. "But all the same, well, I will think it over." All the rest of that evening he pondered over the matter, deeply perplexed. It would be nothing less than cruel to let Sheen enter the ring at Aldershot if he were incompetent. Boxing in the public schools' boxing competition is not a pastime for the incompetent. But he wished very much that Wrykyn should be represented, and also he sympathized with Sheen's eagerness to wipe out the stain on his honour, and the honour of the house. But like Drummond, he could not help harbouring a suspicion that this was a pose. He felt that Sheen was intoxicated by his imagination. Every one likes to picture himself doing dashing things in the limelight, with an appreciative multitude to applaud. Would this mood stand the test of action? Against this there was the evidence of Joe Bevan. Joe had said that Sheen was worthy to fight for his school, and Joe knew. Mr. Spence went to bed, still in a state of doubt. Next morning he hit upon a solution of the difficulty. Wandering in the grounds before school, he came upon O'Hara, who, as has been stated before, had won the light weights at Aldershot in the previous year. He had come to Wrykyn for the sports. Here was the man to help him. O'Hara should put on the gloves with Sheen and report. "I'm in rather a difficulty, O'Hara," he said, "and you can help me." "What's that?" inquired O'Hara. "You know both our light weights are on the sick list? I just resigned myself to going down to Aldershot without any one to box, when a boy in Seymour's volunteered for the vacant place. I don't know if you knew him at school. Sheen, do you remember him?" "Sheen?" cried O'Hara in amazement. "Not Sheen?" His recollections of Sheen were not conducive to a picture of him as a public school boxer. "Yes, I had never heard of him as a boxer. Still, he seems very anxious to go down, and he certainly has one remarkable testimonial, and as there's no one else—" "And what shall I do?" asked O'Hara. "I want you, if you will, to give him a trial in the dinner hour. Just see if he's any good at all. If he isn't, of course, don't hit him about a great deal. But if he shows signs of being a useful man, extend him. See what he can do." "Very well, sir," said O'Hara. "And you might look in at my house at tea-time, if you have nothing better to do, and tell me what you think of him." At 5 o'clock, when he entered Mr. Spence's study, O'Hara's face wore the awe-struck look of one who had seen visions. "Well," said Mr. Spence, "did you find him any good?" "Good," said O'Hara. "He'll beat them all. He's a champion. There's no stopping him." "What an extraordinary thing!" said Mr. Spence. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Sheen goes to Aldershot. At Sheen's request, Mr. Spence made no announcement of the fact that Wrykyn would be represented in the light weights. It would be time enough, Sheen felt, for the school to know that he was a boxer when he had been down and shown what he could do. His appearance in his new role would be the most surprising thing that had happened in the place for years, and it would be a painful anticlimax if, after all the excitement which would be caused by the discovery that he could use his hands, he were to be defeated in his first bout. Whereas, if he happened to win, the announcement of his victory would be all the more impressive, coming unexpectedly. To himself he did not admit the possibility of defeat. He had braced himself up for the ordeal, and he refused to acknowledge to himself that he might not come out of it well. Besides, Joe Bevan continued to express hopeful opinions.
"Just you keep your head, sir," he said, "and you'll win. Lots of these gentlemen, they're champions when they're practicing, and you'd think nothing wouldn't stop them when they get into the ring. But they get wild directly they begin, and forget everything they've been taught, and where are they then? Why, on the floor, waiting for the referee to count them out."
This picture might have encouraged Sheen more if he had not reflected that he was just as likely to fall into this error as were his opponents.
What you want to remember is to keep that guard up. Nothing can beat that. And push out your left straight. The straight left rules the boxing world. And be earnest about it. Be as friendly as you like afterwards, but while you are in the ring, say to yourself, "Well, it's you or me," and don't be too kind.
"I wish you would come down to second me, Joe," said Sheen.
"I'll have a jolly good try, sir," said Joe Bevan. "Let me see. You'll be going down the night before. I can't come down then, but I'll try and manage it by an early train on the day."
"How about Francis?"
"Oh, Francis can look after himself for one day. He's not the sort of boy to run wild if he's left alone for a few hours."
"Then you think you can manage it?"
"Yes, sir. If I'm not there for your first fight, I shall come in time to second you in the final."
"If I get there," said Sheen.
"Good seconding's half the battle. These soldiers they give you at Aldershot, well, they don't know the business, as the saying is. They don't look after their man, not like I could. I saw young what's-his-name of Rugby, Stevens. He was beaten in the final by a gentleman from Harrow. I saw him fight there a couple of years ago. After the first round he was leading. Not by much, but still, he was a point or two ahead. Well, he went to his corner, and his seconds sent him up for the next round in the same state he'd got there in. They hadn't done a thing to him. Why, if I'd been in his corner, I'd have taken him and sponged him, and sent him up again as fresh as he could be. You must have a good second if you're to win. When you're all on top of your man, I don't say. But you get a young gentleman of your own class, just about as quick and strong as you are, and then you'll know where the seconding comes in."
"Then for goodness' sake don't make any mistake about coming down," said Sheen.
"I'll be there, sir," said Joe Bevan.
The Queen's Avenue Gymnasium at Aldershot is a roomy place, but it is always crowded on the public schools' day. Sisters and cousins and aunts of competitors flock there to see Tommy or Bobby perform, under the impression, it is to be supposed, that he is about to take part in a pleasant frolic, a sort of merry parlour game. What their opinion is after he emerges from a warm 3 rounds is not known. Then there are soldiers in scores. Their views on boxing as a sport are crisp and easily defined. What they want is gore. Others of the spectators are old boys, come to see how the school can behave in an emergency, and to find out whether there are still experts like Jones, who won the Middles in '96, or Robinson, who was runner-up in the Feathers in the same year, or whether, as they have darkly suspected for some time, the school has gone to the dogs since they left. The usual crowd was gathered in the seats round the ring when Sheen came out of the dressing-room and sat down in an obscure corner at the end of the barrier which divides the gymnasium into 2 parts on these occasions. He felt very lonely. Mr. Spence and the school instructor were watching the gymnastics, which had just started upon their lengthy course. The Ryken pair were not expected to figure high on the list this year. He could have joined Mr. Spence, but at the moment he felt disinclined for conversation. If he had been a more enthusiastic cricketer, he would have recognized the feeling as that which attacks a batsman before he goes to the wicket. It is not precisely funk. It is rather a desire to accelerate the flight of time and get to business quickly. All things come to him who waits, and among them is that unpleasant sensation of a cold hand upon the portion of the body which lies behind the third waistcoat button. The boxing had begun with a bout between two featherweights, both obviously suffering from stage fright. They were fighting in a scrambling and unscientific manner, which bore out Mr. Bevan's statements on the subject of losing one's head. Sheen felt that both were capable of better things. In the second and third rounds this proved to be the case, and the contest came to an end amidst applause. The next pair were lightweights, and Sheen settled himself to watch more attentively. From these he would gather some indication of what he might expect to find when he entered the ring. He would not have to fight for some time yet. In the drawing for numbers, which had taken place in the dressing-room, he had picked a 3. There would be another lightweight battle before he was called upon. His opponent was a Tunbridgian, who, from the glimpse Sheen caught of him, seemed muscular. But he, Sheen, had the advantage in reach, and build on that. After opening tamely, the lightweight bout had become vigorous in the second round, and both men had apparently forgotten that their right arms had been given them by nature for the purpose of guarding. They were going at it in hurricane fashion all over the ring. Sheen was horrified to feel symptoms of a return of that old sensation of panic which had caused him, on that dark day early in the term, to flee Albert and his wicked works. He set his teeth and fought it down, and after a bad minute he was able to argue himself into a proper frame of mind again. After all, that sort of thing looked much worse than it really was. Half those blows, which seemed as if they must do tremendous damage, were probably hardly felt by their recipient. He told himself that Francis, and even the knife and boot boy, hit fully as hard or harder, and he had never minded them. At the end of the contest he was once more looking forward to his entrance to the ring with proper fortitude. The fighting was going briskly forward now, sometimes good, sometimes moderate, but always earnest, and he found himself contemplating, without undue excitement, the fact that at the end of the bout which had just begun, between middleweights from St. Paul's and Wellington, it would be his turn to perform. As luck would have it, he had not so long to wait as he had expected, for the Pauline, taking the lead after the first few exchanges, outfought his man so completely that the referee stopped the contest in the second round. Sheen got up from his corner and went to the dressing-room. The Tunbridgian was already there. He took off his coat. Somebody crammed his hands into the gloves, and from that moment the last trace of nervousness left him. He trembled with the excitement of the thing, and hoped sincerely that no one would notice it and think that he was afraid. Then, amidst a clapping of hands which sounded faint and far off, he followed his opponent to the ring and ducked under the ropes. The referee consulted a paper which he held, and announced the names. R.D. Sheen, Wrykyn College. Sheen wriggled his fingers right into the gloves, and thought of Joe Bevan. What had Joe said? Keep that guard up, the straight left. Keep that guard, the straight left. Keep that... A. W. Bird, Tunbridge School. There was a fresh outburst of applause. The Tunbridgian had shown up well in the competition of the previous year, and the crowd welcomed him as an old friend. Keep that guard up, straight left. Straight left, guard up. Seconds out of the ring. Guard up, not too high. Straight left. It beats the world. What an age that man was calling time.
guard up, straight. Time, said the referee.
Sheen, filled with a great calm, walked out of his corner and shook hands with his opponent. End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. A Good Start. It was all over in half a minute. The Tonbridgian was a two-headed fighter of the rushing type almost immediately after he had shaken hands. Sheen found himself against the ropes, blinking from a heavy hit between the eyes. Through the mist he saw his opponent sparring up to him, and as he hit he sidestepped. The next moment he was out in the middle again, with his man pressing him hard. There was a quick rally, and then Sheen swung his right at a venture. The blow had no conscious aim. It was purely speculative. But it succeeded. The Tonbridgian fell with a thud. Sheen drew back. The thing seemed pathetic. He had braced himself up for a long fight, and it had ended in half a minute. His sensations were mixed. The fighting half of him was praying that his man would get up and start again. The prudent half realized that it was best that he should stay down. He had other fights before him before he could call that silver medal his own, and this would give him an invaluable start in the race. His rivals had all had to battle hard in their opening bouts. The Tonbridgian's rigidity had given place to spasmodic efforts to rise. He got on one knee, and his gloved hand roamed feebly about in search of a hold. It was plain that he had shot his bolt. The referee signed to his seconds, who ducked into the ring and carried him to his corner. Sheen walked back to his own corner and sat down. Presently the referee called out his name as the winner, and he went across the ring and shook hands with his opponent, who was now himself again. He overheard snatches of conversation as he made his way through the crowd to the dressing-room.
"Useful boxer, that Wrykyn boy. Shortest fight I've seen here since Hopley won the heavyweights. Fluke, do you think? Don't know. Came to the same thing in the end, anyhow. Caught him fair. Hard luck on that Tonbridge man. He's a good boxer, really. Did well here last year."
Then an outburst of handclaps drowned the speakers' voices. A swarthy youth with a Ripton pink and green on his vest had pushed past him and was entering the ring. As he entered the dressing-room he heard the referee announcing the names. So that was the famous Peteiro. Sheen admitted to himself that he looked tough, and hurried into his coat and out of the dressing-room again so as to be able to see how the Ripton terror shaped. It was plainly not a one-sided encounter. Peteiro's opponent hailed from St. Paul's, a school that had a habit of turning out boxers. At the end of the first round it seemed that honors were even. The great Peteiro had taken as much as he had given, and once had been uncompromisingly floored by the Pauline's left. But in the second round he began to gain points. For a boy of his weight he had a terrific hit with the right, and 3 applications of this to the ribs early in the round took much of the sting out of the Pauline's blows. He fought on with undiminished pluck, but the Riptonian was too strong for him, and the third round was a rout. To quote the Sportsman of the following day, Peteiro crowded in a lot of work with both hands and scored a popular victory. Sheen looked thoughtful at the conclusion of the fight. There was no doubt that Drummond's antagonist of the previous year was formidable. Yet Sheen believed himself to be the cleverer of the two. At any rate, Peteiro had given no signs of possessing much cunning. To all appearances he was a tough, go-ahead fighter, with a right which would drill a hole in a steel plate. Had he sufficient skill to baffle his, Sheen's, strong tactics? If only Joe Bevan would come! With Joe in his corner to direct him, he would feel safe. but of Joe up to the present there were no signs. Mr. Spence came and sat down beside him.
"Well, Sheen," he said, "so you won your first fight. Keep it up."
"I'll try, sir," said Sheen.
"What do you think of Peteiro?"
"I was just wondering, sir. He hits very hard."
"Very hard indeed."
"But he doesn't look as if he was very clever."
"Not a bit. Just a plain slogger, that's all. That's why Drummond beat him last year in the featherweights. In strength there was no comparison, but Drummond was just too clever for him. You will be the same, Sheen."
"I hope so, sir," said Sheen. After lunch the second act of the performance began. Sheen had to meet a boxer from Harrow who had drawn a bye in the first round of the competition. This proved a harder fight than his first encounter, but by virtue of a stout heart and a straight left he came through it successfully, and there was no doubt as to what the decision would be. Both judges voted for him. Peteiro demolished a Radleian in his next fight. By the middle of the afternoon there were 3 lightweights in the running: Sheen, Peteiro, and a boy from Clifton. Sheen drew the bye, and sparred in an outer room with a soldier, who was inclined to take the thing easily. Sheen, with the thought of the final in his mind, was only too ready to oblige him. They sparred an innocuous 3 rounds, and the man-of-war was kind enough to whisper in his ear as they left the room that he hoped he would win the final, and that he himself had a matter of 1 and 6pence with old Spud Smith on his success.
"For I'm a man," said the amiable warrior confidentially, "as knows class when he sees it. You're class, sir, that's what you are."
This, taken in conjunction with the fact that if the worst came to the worst he had, at any rate, won a medal by having got into the final, cheered Sheen. If only Joe Bevan had appeared, he would have been perfectly contented. But there were no signs of Joe. End of chapter 21. Chapter 22. A Good Finish.
"Final lightweights!"
shouted the referee. A murmur of interest from the ringside chairs.
R.D. Sheen, Wrykyn College.
Sheen got his full measure of applause this time. His victories in the preliminary bouts had won him favor with the spectators.
J. Peteiro, Ripton School.
"Go it, Ripton!" cried a voice from near the door. The referee frowned in the direction of this audacious partisan, and expressed a hope that the audience would kindly refrain from comment during the rounds. Then he turned to the ring again and announced the names a second time.
Sheen, Peteiro.
The Ripton man was sitting with a hand on each knee, listening to the advice of his school instructor, who had thrust head and shoulders through the ropes, and was busy impressing some point upon him. Sheen found himself noticing the most trivial things with extraordinary clearness. In the first row of the spectators sat a man with a party-coloured tie. He wondered idly what tie it was. It was rather like one worn by members of Templar's house at Wrykyn. Why were the ropes of the ring red? He rather liked the colour. There was a man lighting a pipe. Would he blow out the match or extinguish it with a wave of the hand? What a beast Peteiro looked! He really was a nigger. He must look out for that right of his. The straight left. Push it out. Straight left ruled the boxing world. Where was Joe? He must have missed the train. Or perhaps he hadn't been able to get away. Why did he want to yawn, he wondered.
Time!
The Ripton man became suddenly active. He almost ran across the ring. A brief handshake, and he had penned Sheen up in his corner before he had time to leave it. It was evident what advice his instructor had been giving him. He meant to force the pace from the start. The suddenness of it threw Sheen momentarily off his balance. He seemed to be in a whirl of blows. A sharp shock from behind. He had run up against the post. Despite everything, he remembered to keep his guard up, and stopped a lashing hit from his antagonist's left. But he was too late to keep out his right. In it came, full on the weakest spot on his left side. The pain of it caused him to double up for an instant, and as he did so his opponent uppercut him. There was no rest for him. Nothing that he had ever experienced with the gloves on approached this. If only he could get out of this corner. Then, almost unconsciously, he recalled Joe Bevan's advice. "If a man's got you in a corner," Joe had said, "fall on him." Patero made another savage swing. Sheen dodged it and hurled himself forward. "Break away," said a dispassionate official voice. Sheen broke away, but now he was out of the corner with the whole good open ring to maneuver in. He could just see the Ripton instructor signaling violently to his opponent, and in reply to the signals, Patero came on again with another fierce rush. But Sheen in the open was a different person from Sheen cooped up in a corner. Francis Hunt had taught him to use his feet. He sidestepped, and turning quickly, found his man staggering past him, overbalanced by the force of his wasted blow. And now it was Sheen who attacked, and Patero who tried to escape. 2 swift hits he got in before his opponents could face round, and another as he turned and rushed. Then for a while the battle raged without science all over the ring. Gradually, with a cold feeling of dismay, Sheen realized that his strength was going. The pace was too hot. He could not keep it up. His left counters were losing their force. Now he was merely pushing his glove into the Ripton man's face. It was not enough. The other was getting to close quarters, and that right of his seemed stronger than ever. He was against the ropes now, gasping for breath, and Patero's right was thudding against his ribs. It could not last. He gathered all his strength and put it into a straight left. It took the Ripton man in the throat and drove him back a step. He came on again. Again Sheen stopped him. It was his last effort. He could do no more. Everything seemed black to him. He leaned against the ropes and drank in the air in great gulps. "Time!" said the referee. The word was lost in the shouts that rose from the packed seats. Sheen tottered to his corner and sat down. "Keep it up, sir, keep it up," said a voice. "Bear it that the opposed may beware of thee. Don't forget the guard, and the straight left beats the world." It was Joe, at the 11th hour. With a delicious feeling of content, Sheen leaned back in his chair. It would be all right now. He felt that the matter had been taken out of his hands. A more experienced brain than his would look after the generalship of the fight. As the moments of the half-minute's rest slid away, he discovered the truth of Joe's remarks on the value of a good second. In his other fights, the napping of the towel had hardly stirred the hair on his forehead. Joe's energetic arm set a perfect gale blowing. The cool air revived him. He opened his mouth and drank it in. A spongeful of cold water completed the cure. Long before the call of time, he was ready for the next round. "Keep away from him, sir," said Joe, "and score with that left of yours. Don't try the right yet. Keep it for guarding. Box clever. Don't let him corner you. Slip him when he rushes. Cool and steady does it. Don't aim at his face too much. Go down below. That's the department. And use your feet. Get about quick, and you'll find he don't like that. 'Hullo,' says he, 'I can't touch him.' Then, when he's tired, go in." The pupil nodded with closed eyes. While these words of wisdom were proceeding from the mouth of Mr. Bevan, another conversation was taking place which would have interested Sheen if he could have heard it. Mr. Spence and the school instructor were watching the final from the seats under the side windows.
"It's extraordinary," said Mr. Spence. "The boy's wonderfully good for the short time he has been learning. You ought to be proud of your pupil."
"Sir?"
"I was saying that Sheen does you credit." "Not me, sir." "What? He told me he had been taking lessons. Didn't you teach him?" "Never set eyes on him till this moment. Wish I had, sir. He's the sort of pupil I could wish for."
Mr. Spence bent forward and scanned the features of the man who was attending the Wrykinian.
"Why," he said, "surely that's Bevan. Joe Bevan. I knew him at Cambridge."
"Yes, sir, that's Bevan," replied the instructor. "He teaches boxing at Wrykyn now, sir."
"At Wrykyn? Where?"
"Up the river, at the Blue Boar, sir," said the instructor, quite innocently, for it did not occur to him that this simple little bit of information was just so much incriminating evidence against Sheen. Mr. Spence said nothing, but he opened his eyes very wide. Recalling his recent conversation with Sheen, he remembered that the boy had told him he had been taking lessons, and also that Joe Bevan, the ex-pugilist, had expressed a high opinion of his work. Mr. Spence had imagined that Bevan had been a chance spectator of the boy's skill, but it would now seem that Bevan himself had taught Sheen. This matter, decided Mr. Spence, must be looked into, for it was palpable that Sheen had broken bounds in order to attend Bevan's boxing saloon up the river. For the present, however, Mr. Spence was content to say nothing. Sheen came up for the second round fresh and confident. His head was clear, and his breath no longer came in gasps. There was to be no rallying this time. He had had the worst of the first round, and meant to make up his lost points. Peteiro, losing no time, dashed in. Sheen met him with a left in the face, and gave way a foot. Again Peteiro rushed, and again he was stopped. As he bored in for the third time, Sheen slipped him. The Ripton man paused and dropped his guard for a moment. Sheen's left shot out once more, and found its mark. Peteiro swung his right viciously, but without effect. Another swift counter added one more point to Sheen's score. Sheen nearly chuckled. It was all so beautifully simple. What a fool he had been to mix it up in the first round! If he only kept his head and stuck to out-fighting, he could win with ease. The man couldn't box. He was nothing more than a slogger. Here he came, as usual, with the old familiar rush. Out went his left. But it missed its billet. Peteiro had checked his rush after the first movement, and now he came in with both hands. It was the first time during the round that he had got to close quarters, and he made the most of it. Sheen's blows were as frequent, but his were harder. He drove at the body, right and left, and once again the call of "time" extricated Sheen from an awkward position. As far as points were concerned, he had had the best of the round, but he was very sore and bruised. His left side was one dull ache. "Keep away from him, sir," said Joe Bevan. "You were ahead on that round. Keep away all the time unless he gets tired. But if you see me signalling, then go in all you can and have a fight." There was a suspicion of weariness about the look of the Ripton champion as he shook hands for the last round. He was beginning to feel the effects of his hurricane fighting in the opening rounds. He began quietly, sparring for an opening. Sheen led with his left. Peteiro was too late with his guard. Sheen tried again, a double lead. His opponent guarded the first blow, but the second went home heavily on the body, and he gave way a step. Then from the corner of his eye Sheen saw Bevan gesticulating wildly, so, taking his life in his hands, He abandoned his waiting game, dropped his guard, and dashed in to fight. Peteiro met him doggedly. For a few minutes the exchanges were even. Then suddenly the Riptonian's blows began to weaken. He got home his right on the head, and Sheen hardly felt it, and in a flash there came to him the glorious certainty that the game was his. He was winning, winning, winning.
"That's enough," said the referee.
The Ripton man was leaning against the ropes, utterly spent, at almost the same spot where Sheen had leaned at the end of the first round. The last attack had finished him. His seconds helped him to his corner. The referee waved his hand.
"Sheen wins," he said.
And that was the greatest moment of his life. End of chapter 22. Chapter 23. A Surprise for Seymour's. Seymour's house took in one copy of The Sportsman daily. On the morning after the Aldershot competition, Linton met the paper boy at the door on his return from the Fives Courts, where he had been playing a couple of before-breakfast games with Dunstable. He relieved him of the house copy, and opened it to see how the Wrykyn pair had performed in the gymnastics. He did not expect anything great, having a rooted contempt for both experts, who were small and, except in the gymnasium, obscure. Indeed, he had gone so far on the previous day as to express a hope that Biddle, the more despicable of the two, would fall off the horizontal bar and break his neck. Still, he might as well see where they had come out. After all, with all their faults, they were human beings like himself, and Wrykynians. The competition was reported in the boxing column. The first thing that caught his eye was the name of the school among the headlines. "Honours," said the headline, "for St. Paul's, Harrow, and Wrykyn." "Hello," said Linton, "what's all this?" Then the thing came on him with nothing to soften the shock. He had folded the paper, and the last words on the half uppermost were, "Final. Sheen beat Peteiro." Linton had often read novels in which some important document swam before the eyes of the hero or the heroine, but he had never understood the full meaning of the phrase until he read those words, "Sheen beat Peteiro." There was no mistake about it. There the thing was. It was impossible for the Sportsman to have been hoaxed. No, the incredible, outrageous fact must be faced. Sheen had been down to Aldershot and won a silver medal. Sheen! Sheen! Sheen who was, well, who, in a word, was Sheen. Linton read on like one in a dream. "The lightweights fell," said the writer, "to a newcomer, Sheen, of Wrykyn." Sheen! "A clever youngster, with a strong defence and a beautiful straight left, doubtless the result of tuition from the middleweight ex-champion, Joe Bevan, who was in his corner for the final bout. None of the opponents gave him much trouble except Peteiro of Ripton, whom he met in the final. A very game and determined fight was seen when these two met, but Sheen's skill and condition discounted the rushing tactics of his adversary, and in the last minute of the third round the referee stopped the encounter. Game and determined! Sheen! Sympathy was freely expressed for Peteiro, who has thus been runner-up 2 years in succession. He, however, met a better man, and paid the penalty. The admirable pluck with which Sheen bore his punishment, and gradually wore his man down, made his victory the most popular of the day's programme. Well! Details of the fighting describe Sheen as cutting out the work, popping in several nice lefts, swinging his right for the point, and executing numerous other incredible manoeuvres. Sheen! You caught the name correctly?
Sheen, I'll trouble you." Linton stared blankly across the school grounds. Then he burst into a sudden yell of laughter. On that very morning the senior day-room was going to court-martial Sheen for disgracing the house. The resolution had been passed on the previous afternoon, probably just as he was putting the finishing touches to the most popular victory of the day's program. "This," said Linton, "is rich." He grubbed a little hole in one of Mr. Seymour's flower-beds, and laid the sportsman to rest in it. The news would be about the school at 9 o'clock, but if he could keep it from the senior day-room till the brief interval between breakfast and school, all would be well, and he would have the pure pleasure of seeing that backbone of the house make a complete ass of itself. A thought struck him. He unearthed the sportsman and put it in his pocket. He strolled into the senior day-room after breakfast. "Anyone seen the Sporter this morning?" he inquired. No one had seen it. "The thing hasn't come," said someone. "Good," said Linton to himself. At this point Stanning strolled into the room. "I'm a witness," he said in answer to Linton's look of inquiry. "We're doing this thing in style. I depose that I saw the prisoner cutting off on the whatever day it was, when he ought to have been saving our lives from the fury of the mob. Hadn't somebody better bring the prisoner into the dock?" "I'll go," said Linton promptly. "I may be a little time, but don't get worried. I'll bring him all right." He went upstairs to Sheen's study, feeling like an impresario about to produce a new play which is sure to create a sensation. Sheen was in. There was a ridge of purple under his left eye, but he was otherwise intact. "Gratulate you, Sheen," said Linton. For an instant Sheen hesitated. He had rehearsed this kind of scene in his mind, and sometimes he saw himself playing a genial, forgiving, "let's say no more about it, we all make mistakes, but in future" role, sometimes being cold, haughty, and distant, and repelling friendly advances with icy disdain. If anybody but Linton had been the first to congratulate him, he might have decided on this second line of action. But he liked Linton, and wanted to be friendly with him. "Thanks," he said. Linton sat down on the table, and burst into a torrent of speech. "You are a man! What did you want to do it for? Where the dickens did you learn to box? And why on earth, if you can win silver medals at Aldershot, didn't you box for the house and smash up that sidey-ass Stanning? I say, look here, I suppose we haven't been making idiots of ourselves all the time, have we?" "I shouldn't wonder," said Sheen. "How?" "I mean you did. What I mean to say is—" "Oh, hang it, you know! You did cut off when we had that row in the town, didn't you?" "Yes," said Sheen, "I did." With that medal in his pocket, it cost him no effort to make the confession. "I'm glad of that. I mean, I'm glad we haven't been such fools as we might have been. You see, we only had Stanning's word to go on." Sheen started. "Stanning?" he said. "What do you mean?" "He was the chap who started the story. Didn't you know? He told everybody." "I thought it was Drummond," said Sheen blankly. "You remember meeting me outside his study the day after? I thought he told you then." "Drummond? Not a bit of it. He swore you hadn't been with him at all. He was as sick as anything when I said I thought I'd seen you with him." Sheen stopped. "I wish I'd known," he concluded. Then, after a pause, "So it was Stanning?" "Yes. Conceited beast! Oh, I say!" "I see it all now. Joe Bevan taught you to box."
Yes. Then that's how you came to be at the Blue Boar that day. He's the Bevan who runs it. That's his brother. He's got a gymnasium up at the top. I used to go there every day.
But I say, great Scott, what are you going to do about that?
How do you mean?
Why, Spence is sure to ask you who taught you to box. He must know you didn't learn with the instructor. Then it'll all come out, and you'll get dropped on for going up the river and going to the pub.
Perhaps he won't ask, said Sheen.
Hope not. Oh, by the way,
what's up?
Just remembered what I came up for. It's an awful rag. The senior day room are going to court-martial you.
Court-martial me?
For funking. They don't know about Aldershot, not a word. I bagged the Sportsman early and hid it. They're going to get the surprise of their lifetime. I said I'd come up and fetch you.
I shan't go, said Sheen.
Linton looked alarmed. Oh, but I say, you must. Don't spoil the thing. Can't you see what a rag it'll be?
I'm not going to sweat downstairs for the benefit of the senior day room.
I say, said Linton, Stanning's there.
What?
He's a witness, said Linton, grinning. Sheen got up. Come on, he said. Linton came on. Down in the senior day room the court was patiently awaiting the prisoner. Eager anticipation was stamped on its expressive features. "Beastly time he is," said Clayton. Clayton was acting as president. "We shall have to buck up," said Stanning. "Hullo, here he is at last. Come in, Linton." "I was going to," said Linton, "but thanks all the same. Come along, Sheen." "Shut that door, Linton," said Stanning from his seat on the table. "All right, Stanning," said Linton. "Anything to oblige. Shall I bring up a chair for you to rest your feet on?" "Forge ahead, Clayton," said Stanning to the president. The president opened the court-martial in unofficial phraseology. "Look here, Sheen," he said, "we've come to the conclusion that this has got a bit too thick." "You mustn't talk in that chatty way, Clayton," interrupted Linton. "Prisoner at the bar's the right expression to use. Why don't you let somebody else have a look in? You're the rottenest president of a court-martial I ever saw." "Don't rag, Linton," said Clayton with an austere frown. "This is serious." "Glad you told me," said Linton. "Go on." "Can't you sit down, Linton?" said Stanning. "I was only waiting for leave. Thanks. You were saying something, Clayton. It sounded pretty average rot, but you'd better unburden your soul." The president resumed. "We want to know if you've anything to say." "You don't give him a chance," said Linton. "You bagged the conversation so." "About disgracing the house." "By getting the Gotford, you know, Sheen," explained Linton. "Clayton thinks that work's a bad habit and ought to be discouraged." Clayton glared and looked at Stanning. He was not equal to the task of tackling Linton himself. Stanning interposed. "Don't rot, Linton. We haven't much time as it is." "Sorry," said Linton. "You've let the house down awfully," said Clayton. "Yes," said Sheen. Linton took the paper out of his pocket and smoothed it out. "Seen the Sporter?" he asked casually. His neighbour grabbed at it. "I thought it hadn't come," he said. "Good account of Aldershot," said Linton. He leaned back in his chair as 2 or 3 of the senior day-room collected round the Sportsman. "Hullo, we won the gym!" Rot! Let's have a look."
This tremendous announcement quite eclipsed the court-martial as an object of popular interest. The senior day-room surged round the holder of the paper.
"Give us a chance," he protested.
"We can't have. Where is it? Biddle and Smith are simply hopeless. How the dickens can they have got the shield?"
"What a goat you are!" said a voice reproachfully to the possessor of the paper.
"Look at this. It says Cheltenham got it. And here we are, 17th. Fat lot of shield we've won." "Then what the deuce does this mean? Honours for St. Paul's, Harrow, and Wrykyn." "Perhaps it refers to the boxing," suggested Linton. "But we didn't send anyone up. Look here. Harrow won the heavies. St. Paul's got the middles. Hullo!"
"Great Scott!"
said the senior day-room. There was a blank silence. Linton whistled softly to himself. The gaze of the senior day-room was concentrated on that ridge of purple beneath Sheen's left eye. Clayton was the first to speak. For some time he had been waiting for sufficient silence to enable him to proceed with his presidential duties. He addressed himself to Sheen.
"Look here, Sheen," he said. "We want to know what you've got to say for yourself. You go disgracing the house—"
The stunned senior day-room were roused to speech.
"Oh, chuck it, Clayton!" "Don't be a fool, Clayton!"
"Silly idiot!" Clayton looked round in pained surprise at this sudden withdrawal of popular support. "You'd better be polite to Sheen," said Linton. "He won the lightweights at Aldershot yesterday." The silence once more became strained. "Well," said Sheen, "weren't you going to court-martial me, or something? Clayton, weren't you saying something?" Clayton started. He had not yet grasped the situation entirely, but he realized dimly that by some miracle Sheen had turned in an instant into a most formidable person.
No," he said. "No, nothing."
"The thing seems to have fallen through, Sheen," said Linton. "Great pity. Started so well, too. Clayton always makes a mess of things." "Then I'd just like to say one thing," said Sheen. Respectful attention from the senior day-room. "I only want to know why you can't manage things of this sort by yourselves, without dragging in men from other houses." "Especially men like Stanning," said Linton. "The same thing occurred to me. It's lucky Drummond wasn't here. Remember the last time, you chaps?" The chaps did. Stanning became an object of critical interest. After all, who was Stanning? What right had he to come and sit on tables in Seymour's and interfere with the affairs of the house? The allusion to last time was lost upon Sheen, but he saw that it had not improved Stanning's position with the spectators. He opened the door. "Good-bye, Stanning," he said.
"If I hadn't hurt my wrist—"
Stanning began. "Hurt your wrist?" said Sheen. "You've got a bad attack of Patero. That was what was the matter with you."
"You think that everyone's a funk like yourself," said Stanning.
"Pity they aren't," said Linton. "We should do rather well down at Aldershot. And he wasn't such a terror after all, Sheen, was he? You beat him in 2½ rounds, didn't you? Think what Stanning might have done if only he hadn't sprained his poor wrist just in time."
"Look here, Linton—"
"Some are born with sprained wrists," continued the speaker. "Some achieve sprained wrists, like Stanning." Stanning took a step towards him. "Don't forget you've a sprained wrist," said Linton. "Come on, Stanning," said Sheen, who was still holding the door open. You'll be much more comfortable in your own house. I'll show you out."
"I suppose," said Stanning in the passage, "you think you've scored off me."
"That," said Sheen pleasantly, "is rather the idea. Good-bye." End of chapter 23. Chapter 24. Bruce Explains. Mr. Spence was a master with a great deal of sympathy and a highly developed sense of duty. It was the combination of these two qualities which made it so difficult for him to determine on a suitable course of action in relation to Sheen's out-of-bounds exploits. As a private individual he had nothing but admiration for the sporting way in which Sheen had fought his uphill fight. He felt that he himself, in similar circumstances, would have broken any number of school rules. But, as a master, it was his duty, he considered, to report him. If a master ignored a breach of rules in one case, with which he happened to sympathize, he would in common fairness be compelled to overlook a similar breach of rules in other cases, even if he did not sympathize with them, in which event he would be of small use as a master. On the other hand, Sheen's case was so exceptional that he might very well compromise to a certain extent between the claims of sympathy and those of duty. If he were to go to the headmaster and state baldly that Sheen had been in the habit for the last half-term of visiting an up-river public-house, the headmaster would get an entirely wrong idea of the matter, and suspect all sorts of things which had no existence in fact. When a boy is accused of frequenting a public-house, the head magisterial mind leaps naturally to stale fumes and the drunken stagger. So Mr. Spence decided on a compromise. He sent for Sheen, and having congratulated him warmly on his victory in the light weights, proceeded as follows.
"You have given me to understand, Sheen, that you were taught boxing by Bevan?"
"Yes, sir."
"At the Blue Boar?"
"Yes, sir."
"This puts me in a rather difficult position, Sheen. Much as I dislike doing it, I am afraid I shall have to report this matter to the headmaster."
Sheen said he supposed so. He saw Mr. Spence's point.
"But I shall not mention the Blue Boar. If I did, the headmaster might get quite the wrong impression. He would not understand all the circumstances. So I shall simply mention that you broke bounds by going up the river. I shall tell him the whole story, you understand, and it's quite possible that you will hear no more of the affair. I'm sure I hope so. But you understand my position?"
"Yes, sir."
"That's all, then, Sheen. Oh, by the way, you wouldn't care for a game of fives before breakfast tomorrow, I suppose?"
"I should like it, sir."
"Not too stiff?"
"No, sir."
"Very well, then. I'll be there by 7:15.
Jack Bruce was waiting to see the headmaster in his study at the end of afternoon school.
"Well, Bruce," said the headmaster, coming into the room and laying down some books on the table, "do you want to speak to me? Will you give your father my congratulations on his victory? I shall be writing to him tonight. I see from the paper that the polling was very even. Apparently one or two voters arrived at the last moment and turned the scale."
"Yes, sir."
"It is a most gratifying result. I am sure that, apart from our political views, we should all have been disappointed if your father had not won. Please congratulate him sincerely."
"Yes, sir."
"Well, Bruce, and what was it that you wished to see me about?"
Bruce was about to reply when the door opened and Mr. Spence came in.
"One moment, Bruce," said the headmaster. "Yes, Spence?"
Mr. Spence made his report clearly and concisely. Bruce listened with interest. He thought it hardly playing the game for the gymnasium master to hand Sheen over to be executed at the very moment when the school was shaking hands with itself over the one decent thing that had been done for it in the course of the athletic year. But he told himself philosophically that he supposed masters had to do these things. Then he noticed with some surprise that Mr. Spence was putting the matter in a very favourable light for the accused. He was avoiding with some care any mention of the Blue Boar. When he had occasion to refer to the scene of Sheen's training, he mentioned it vaguely as a house.
"This man Bevan, who is an excellent fellow and a personal friend of my own, has a house some way up the river."
Of course a public house is a house.
"Up the river,"
said the headmaster meditatively. It seemed that that was all that was wrong. The prosecution centred round that point and no other. Jack Bruce, as he listened, saw his way of coping with the situation.
"Thank you, Spence,"
said the headmaster at the conclusion of the narrative.
"I quite understand that Sheen's conduct was very excusable. But I distinctly said, I placed the upper river out of bounds. Well, I will see Sheen and speak to him. I will speak to him."
Mr. Spence left the room.
"Please, sir," said Jack Bruce. "Ah, Bruce, I am afraid I have kept you some little time." "Yes?"
"I couldn't help hearing what Mr. Spence was saying to you about Sheen, sir. I don't think he knows quite what really happened."
"You mean—"
"Sheen went there by road. I used to take him in my motor."
What did you say, Bruce?"
"My motor car, sir. That's to say, my father's. We used to go together every day."
"I am glad to hear it. I am glad. Then I need say nothing to Sheen after all. I am glad. But, Bruce," proceeded the headmaster after a pause.
"Yes, sir?"
Are you in the habit of driving a motor car frequently?"
"Every day, sir. You see, I am going to take up motors when I leave school, so it's all education." The headmaster was silent. To him the word education meant classics. There was a modern side at Wrykyn, and an engineering side, and also a science side, but in his heart he recognized but one education, the classics. Nothing that he had heard, nothing that he had read in the papers and the monthly reviews, had brought home to him the spirit of the age and the fact that things were not as they used to be so clearly as this one remark of Jack Bruce's. For here was Bruce admitting that in his spare time he drove motors. And stranger still, that he did it not as a wild frolic, but seriously, with a view to his future career.
"The old order changeth,"
thought the headmaster a little sadly. Then he brought himself back from his mental plunge into the future.
"Well, well, Bruce," he said, "we need not discuss the merits and demerits of driving motor cars, need we? What did you wish to see me about?"
"I came to ask if I might get off morning school tomorrow, sir. Those voters who got to the poll just in time and settled the election, I brought them down in the car. And the policeman, he's a radical and voted for Pedder, Mr. Pedder, has sworn, says I was exceeding the speed limit." The headmaster pressed a hand to his forehead, and his mind swam into the future.
"Well, Bruce?"
he said at length, in the voice of one whom nothing can surprise now.
He says I was going 28 miles an hour, and if I can get to the court tomorrow morning I can prove that I wasn't. I brought them to the pole in the little runabout." "And the little runabout," said the headmaster, "does not travel at 28 miles an hour?" "No, sir. It can't go more than 20 at the outside." "Very well, Bruce. You need not come to school tomorrow morning." "Thank you, sir." The headmaster stood thinking. The new order. "Bruce," he said. "Yes, sir?" "Tell me, do I look very old?" Bruce stared. "Do I look 300 years old?" "No, sir," said Bruce, with the stolid wariness of the boy who fears that a master is subtly chaffing him. "I feel more, Bruce," said the headmaster, with a smile. "I feel more. You will remember to congratulate your father for me, won't you?" Outside the door, Jack Bruce paused in deep reflection. "Rum," he said to himself. "Jolly rum." On the senior gravel he met Sheen. "Hello, Sheen," he said. "What are you going to do?" "Drummond wants me to tea with him in the infirmary." "It's all right, then?" "Yes. I got a note from him during afternoon school. You coming?" "All right. I say, Sheen, the old man's rather rum sometimes, isn't he?" "What's he been doing now?" "Oh, nothing. How do you feel after Aldershot? Tell us all about it. I've not heard a word yet." That is the end of chapter 24, and the end of The White